thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to everyone that's going to be watching online now and later. I just want to start by, first of all, expressing our gratitude to our board, many of the members who are here tonight, because it's because of you that an event like this is even possible in the first place. And tonight we are super excited and incredibly fortunate to be hosting Isaac Stonefish. He is the founder of Strategy Risks, which advises companies on how to navigate their China relationships. But he's so much more than that. He's one of the leading voices, I would say, on U.S. China relations. He really has a prominent voice because he has this expertise that comes at the intersection of not just the business world, but he worked as a journalist for many years, based in China, lived there for at least 7 years or maybe more, speaks the language, has been in literally every province in China, I think. Isn't that a fact? Yeah. So he has a very prominent relationship with policymakers, business leaders, as well as journalists and thought leaders in China. So his work has really been crucial. And he was one of the earliest voices, I think, sounding the alarm about China's influence operations in the United States and the broader West, both in the corporate side, on the political side. And he's really made people much more aware of how intertwined all these different relationships are between entities in the United States and in the PRC. He's written a fantastic book called America Second, which is all about how American elites have colluded with China to advance the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. It's really an eye-opening read. It came out a couple of years ago. And in addition to that, he's just featured everywhere. New York Times, The Atlantic. I have this whole list here. I won't go through it, but basically any top publication you can think of, he's and major news outlet, he's always seems to be there. I see his floating head on various news networks as I'm walking through airports, etc. So he seems to be everywhere, and we're happy to have him here tonight. Isaac, I wanted to start by discussing some of the central themes of your work, and in particular of your book, and these links between Chinese political and business interests and American elites. In your book, you documented these long-standing ties between American elites, but I'm wondering how you see things, if at all, if they've changed, because you have a slowdown in China's economy, you have a lot more scrutiny being put, you have the Mike Gallaghers of the world, that are really sounding the alarm and picking up a lot of the themes that you originated. So do you see some of these links either diminishing or changing, maybe because China's changing its tactics? What's the right way to think about the ongoing risk of Chinese influence in the United States?
Thank you. Appreciate that. Things have changed pretty drastically over the last several years. Part of that is because of the growing repression in China. Part of that is the closing of the country with COVID. Part of that is the political reality changing in the United States. And there's a cycle there where the idea that being a friend of China is no longer a politically tenable position to be in the United States has made business leaders who often like to go and work in politics and vice versa, has made it harder for them to do so. And I'll say here, I use friend of China as a technical term. Someone who wants to show friendship to the Chinese people or to the great nation of China, wonderful. Friend of China is a Communist Party term, meaning someone who amplifies and supports the Communist Party. It doesn't mean someone who's a friend of China. And so there's a lot of terminology that the party uses and that Americans will sometimes inadvertently use in these conversations about China. And we just have to understand that they have distinct meanings. But I'm pretty heartened by the awareness that many more Americans have now about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, and I'm sure we'll get into this as well, afraid of xenophobia and race baiting and how we're going to treat Chinese people and Chinese Americans when the war happens.
Can you give us a framework for how to think about Chinese influence operations? Because presumably some of these elite connections are more harmful or less harmful than others. So if some academics, are going over and just talking to other Chinese scholars, I mean, we're pretty irrelevant, so we're not going to actually affect anything important. But presumably there are other types of networks. So like, what's the framework in terms of distinguishing different types of influence between the CCP and elites in the United States, and which do you think are the most concerning going forward?
I would say academics like yourself are actually quite important because you can give legitimacy to ideas and to systems, and Beijing loves finding academics that can trumpet its message and will sometimes adapt messages that academics have and then try to make them into a communist-friendly sort of bouquet, one could say. So, Joseph Nye and soft power, Beijing loved the idea of soft power and would really try to engage with Joseph Nye. Graham Allison and the Thucydides trap, Beijing loved that idea and so would bring him over as much as he could. They do that with Nobel Prize winners. They do it with a lot of other people as well. In terms of the structure of it, do folks know what the United Front is? So 1910s, there was a big dock workers strike in the UK, and Lenin, in his infinite wisdom, thought, well, the dock workers aren't communists, but we can be aligned with them and we can create a united front between the communist parties, which we run, and non-communist parties, so that we can overthrow capitalism and bring on global communism. Mao and Zhou Enlai adapted this idea in the 30s in China and created their own United Front. Today it's called the United Front Work Department. And what United Front does is it seeks to strengthen the party's friends and weaken its enemies, and support and promote positive voices on China and the party and suppress negative ones. And the United Front is, and there's kind of a trope in journalism and ideas, kind of, oh, the most important organization you've never heard of. I think the United Front probably deserves that reputation. So the United Front is both an organization and an idea. In the Chinese context, it's similar to propaganda. So there are propaganda departments in basically every ministry in China and every government department. And there's also a specific propaganda department. And there's the idea of propaganda. It's similar with the United Front. There is a United Front Work Department, but every ministry in China, according to Xi Jinping, is supposed to do United Front work. Xi has described it as drawing concentric circles around the party. It's basically creating links and networks so that people promote China's interests. In some ways, there's some analogies between the Chinese system and the American system. So you know what the People's Liberation Army is? So the PLA, unlike most other armies in the world, is not China's army. It's the party's army. The PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party, and the PLA is supposed to defend the party, not defend China. So the PLA defends China if the party wants it to, but it's the militarized wing of the Communist Party. So imagine if the Republicans had their own army and the head of the Ohio National Guard was the head of the Ohio Republican Army, or the Democrats. It's a similar idea to that, but there's no United Front-like entity in the US government. It's a very different idea from the way our government's structured. So imagine if there was a national religion and there was a church that promoted that national religion and did a lot of influence work to make people feel better about the religion, while at the same time pretending that the church didn't exist, or that the national religion was just reality as opposed to something separate from the state. And that's kind of how the United Front operates.
Well, what is the gospel according to this religion? So when you say the United Front is trying to promote China's interests, is it particular interests, like we want these countries to toe the party line on things like Taiwan or certain conceptions of human rights? Is there some overarching geopolitical objective that the United Front is trying to achieve? Or is it just, hey, whatever Chairman Xi wants at any particular moment, we just have people on the ground and we have entities and it's much more disaggregated? So what's the right way to think?
It's scarier and also blander. It's just this broad agreement with what Beijing is doing. And it's the idea of not questioning and just accepting that China comes in peace. It's accepting a lot of contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. China comes in peace. China's rise is inevitable. China has already won. There's no competition because China doesn't want there to be a competition. And did I say that China comes in peace? So it's these repetitive ideas of just, okay, we don't have to worry about this. This is completely fine. It reminds me, I'm always wary of comparing various totalitarianisms with each other, but the reason that Goebbels had created the sort of Hail Hitler salute was because when you do that, you have to move very quickly and you basically hold your breath when you're doing it. And so you do this action and you stop thinking because you're not breathing. And it's very subtle. It's just a little bit of movement when you're doing it. And it reminds me of some of the United Front tactics of the goal is to basically disengender thinking. The goal is to just more bland and broad acceptance of it.
So it's an atomization strategy. I certainly get that feeling when I'm stepping over stacks of China dailies that are not being read. They're just scattered on American streets. But then that begs the question of how effective are these operations? And can you give us a sense of some of the tangible outcomes or ways that China has actually changed behavior, whether on behalf of a major corporation or the US government or just prominent people, prominent elites in the United States? Because, when you look at international opinion polls, China's favorability is just cratered largely because, China is doing a lot of antagonizing things. And so as much as China has spent all this money trying to get other countries to love China and adopt its policies, it seems like its actual actions on the ground are working at cross purposes. But presumably there's more insidious ways that China can exert influence that may not affect that top line, but are still very important. So could you explain some of those for us?
It's a great question. It's very difficult to know where China should be. If there were an objective reality, how worried should we be about China? And are we more or less worried? And are we less worried because of effectiveness of Chinese propaganda, United Front work, or for other reasons? And I think also of that idea that 50% of advertising is wasted, but no one knows what 50%. And so it's very difficult to know with Chinese propaganda and with United Front work what's effective and what's not. But we see it in several ways. We see it when American celebrities like John Cena apologize to the Chinese people. We see it in the NBA scandal of several years ago. We see it with US corporations pretending that they don't want to talk about politics, being very involved with US or other global political issues, but staying away from Chinese politics. And staying away from Chinese politics is a very political action. You just pretend that you're being apolitical when you're being intensely political. We see it in sister cities between the US and China. It's one of those things, again, where one has to understand the terminology and the intentionality on the Chinese side. The problem with sister cities is not that there's a problem with, say, Philadelphia linking with Suzhou or Hangzhou or big US cities having relationships with Chinese cities. The problem is that sister cities in China are governed by the United Front. And when you have a sister city relationship, you're working with the United Front. So I'm Jewish, and there are Jewish museums that partner with Chinese museums, and they sponsor exhibits on the Holocaust, and they support what China did for the Jews in World War II. China was wonderful to the Jews during World War II. Today, China is committing a genocide against its Muslim population. And so there's this, well, let's focus on the history and let's allow Jewish museums or prominent institutions in the US to whitewash what China's doing today by focusing on a safer history. So a lot of examples like that. I think the other thing too with United Front work and propaganda is that it's so much more effective in China to Chinese people than it is globally. And it's not because Chinese people are by nature more susceptible to this. It's that the people who create these structures of ideas, are doing this in Chinese and are communicating it in Chinese. And they're so much more concerned and worried with Chinese audiences. The propaganda is usually much more strident, but also much more effective in Chinese than it is in English. And Beijing cares so much more about that. And why do they care? They want to stay in power. And it's far more likely that entities in China, either at a lower level or at a higher level, can remove the party from power than anything that we can do here.
Yeah, so can you elaborate on the effect on the Chinese people as far as you see it? Because I've certainly noticed a big uptick in all kinds of nationalist messaging from the regime. You're playing up and financing these big box office Korean War sagas, because that's the war when China defeated the Western imperialists and stood up for their ally North Korea. Do you think that that's having an effect on the Chinese people and that they are increasingly throwing their lot behind the regime? Because we did see protests, during the zero COVID lockdowns. There has been sporadic expressions of dissatisfaction. And when I've talked to Chinese nationals, people will tell me straight up, like they think Xi is basically running the country into the ground. On the other hand, you look at what's going on in Russia, and a lot of people thought Russian citizens would turn on Putin. But from what I understand, especially among the young generation, there's actually a lot of support buying into the kind of nationalist, anti-Western message. So what's your take on what's going on in the Chinese population right now? How effective has this propaganda campaign been?
One of the wonderful things about China is it's such an intellectually diverse place. It's just that the expressions of that diversity are very hard to cull and to cultivate because the environment is so censored and because there's real costs about communicating about that to people like me and really everyone in here. And there's so much costs to saying things that go against the party that people don't say them, and at a point they don't think them. And I think the way to think about it, it's not that China has censorship and we have no censorship. It's that China is a much more censored environment. And you all can think about ideas that you can't say. And why can't you say them? Not because they're necessarily right or wrong, it's just they're not appropriate to say. They're too controversial, they're too this, they're too that. And so come up with an idea like that in your head and then think about if that idea were, I don't like my government, and then it's more on a very concrete level, I don't like Biden, I don't like Trump, I don't like Harris, or I want to overthrow Biden. There are ideas like that in China that people cannot have, and so they don't have them. They internally think that sometimes. And I think the question on nationalism and on opinion polling, it's such a fascinating thing, both from an individual perspective, but also from a market's perspective, because you're in such an information poor environment and you have a wealth of statistics. The problem with Chinese statistics isn't their number. There's so many Chinese statistics. The problem is they're often divorced from reality in a way that's so radically different than the way things are here. And so there's a lot more nationalism on the Chinese internet. And that might be because people are growing more nationalist, or because the censorship mechanisms has changed, or folks who are less nationalist are just posting a lot less, or posting and their posts are getting deleted, or they're talking in different coded ways. We know of nationalist outbursts. There was a tragic killing of a 10-year-old Japanese boy a couple weeks ago on the anniversary of the Japanese invasion of China. So we know of things like that, but it's anecdotal. How many of those would have to happen to point to a shift? It's also because it's such an information poor environment. Was that the only person who got murdered on that day? Did 10 other Japanese children get murdered on that day? Was he the only one? Was that actually really how it happened? It's tough to, in this space, to not sound like a conspiracy theorist, because there's so much information that floats around, you don't really know what to believe. So for example, during the harshest days of China's COVID lockdowns, there was a rumor going around that Beijing was doing this to prepare to invade Taiwan. Because if you think, oh, how do I shut an entire country down for a mass military mobilization? COVID's a great way of doing that. And it's possible that Beijing was just about to invade Taiwan and stopped, or that no one ever had that idea and it was completely false, or somewhere in between. And it's very difficult to know, and we might not know until the archives are open. About 10 years ago, there were two very senior officials who fell from power, and Beijing later said that they were implementing an anti-party coup. Is that true? No idea. Absolutely no idea.
Do you think it had something to do with Hong Kong with the zero COVID lockdowns, because they needed to get control of the city, and they're like, well, if we lock down everything, it kind of gives us carte blanche to really impose national security across the entire country?
My theory on it is it's a way of brutalizing a population so that they will be more pliant to you. So in 1949 and 1950, right after the communists took power, there was this massive campaign. They called it an AntiUS Campaign. But basically what it was is that groups of Chinese would be encouraged to struggle against the landlords or the landed gentry. And sometimes this was, the person who had 2 cows and you only had 1. Sometimes it were wealthy people. And there were convulsions of violence that the party encouraged, and Chinese people killed millions of their neighbors. And so from a very broken sociological perspective, why do you do that? You do that because it makes everyone complicit. You are training people to feel like they are part of the system by having blood on their hands. And so one could draw that analogy with the COVID lockdown and say, we are going to brutalize these people, and we're going to make people, again, tattle on each other and make them all follow these series of quite absurd rules, and they're going to do it. And then when they do that, we're going to have them. So that's a possible explanation for it as well.
How important is the economic slowdown in putting pressure on the regime. Because on the one hand, there were some interesting polls done recently by folks like Scott Rozelle at Stanford and some other public opinion scholars, and they found that for the first time, increasing numbers of Chinese people are saying that their situation, their lives are just worse than they were 5 years ago. That hadn't happened in more than a generation. They also found that more and more people view the system as rigged. And that's something that the CCP is very scared of, that the rich are rich because of their connections and not because of hard work. Before, when you'd ask Chinese people about this, they say, no, it's hard work. And yes, I might still be poor now, but I could be rich. But that seems to be shifting. So that seems to, put some pressure on the regime. On the other hand, this is what you have the Ministry of State Security for. This is what you have the People's Armed Police for. And it's not like there's some written contract where people can say, you didn't raise our living standards enough, so now you have to step out of power. So how, is the regime really threatened by this economic slowdown in any major way? Does it affect the tactics that they need to use in order to keep tabs on the Chinese people? Or is it just one of the things? And at the end of the day, Xi Jinping is not really a hedge fund manager. And so if the GDP is not growing, it's not that big of a deal.
So it's an incredibly important question. And I think about the beginning of the Arab Spring and the impossibility of predicting that, a fruit vendor would spark that. There's a Chinese expression, the spark that causes the prairie fire. And it's incredibly difficult to know where that is. This one very much doesn't seem like it. And in my mind, there's not that much of a change between Chinese people thinking the system is rigged today and them thinking it's rigged 20, 30, 40 years ago. And in hindsight, we could look at what happened in 88 and 89 in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, and it seems inevitable, but it wasn't at the time. And whatever happens next, if this is a very peaceful couple of years for China or a couple of decades, or the Communist Party gets toppled or there's a coup, after it happens, it'll have a feeling of inevitability. But right now, I think it's incredibly difficult to predict. That said, I think Xi Jinping has a lot more to fear from those at the top of the party than those at the bottom. And I'm saying this out of ignorance. I'm saying this because the top of the party is a black box, and we really don't know the most important questions. We know the questions, we don't know the answers to the most important questions about the future of China. What is Xi Jinping's relationship with the other 6 men on the Politburo Standing Committee? What is his relationship with the 2 vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission? One of their predecessors died in criticism. The other one's still in prison. Do they despise Xi? Are they waiting for a time to take him out? Do they love him and adore him? Do they really want to attack Taiwan and Xi Jinping is preventing them? Does Xi really want to attack Taiwan and they're preventing him? We don't know, and we can't know. And I don't think any level of US intelligence has real insight into those questions. So there was a rumor going around Beijing, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that Xi Jinping wouldn't travel overseas because he didn't want to get off his plane, have 3 men on the right, 3 men on the left, shake his hand, say thank you for his service, and then spend the rest of his life under house arrest. Did he actually feel that? Who knows? Again, information poor environment, a lot of these rumors will circulate, but it's so difficult to know. And so I think from a policy perspective, from a business perspective, when you plan, you have to include that uncertainty in your models. You have to think, well, we really have no idea what Xi Jinping thinks. A story on this, because Michael and I will talk, and we'll talk about people who go to China and meet Xi Jinping and meet with the leaders, and they'll come back and they'll think, oh, yes, they just want peace, or they get these bland ideas of what the leaders want. And I remember reading a story of a Western journalist who was interviewing Stalin, and Stalin, when he wanted to, was incredibly charming. He's a really good listener. He could just look you in the eyes and just see you. So the journalist was really taken in by Stalin, and he noticed Stalin sitting there, and Stalin's doodling. And he looks down and sees that Stalin is just doodling wolves. Story always stuck with me.
Okay, so if the Chinese government is a black box, even to US intelligence, I want to ask you about the American system, and we have this election coming up. So first of all, who's going to win? I want to know that. But
I know the answer.
But in addition, presumably the United States having some kind of contested election, or Americans tearing themselves apart, would really be great for the CCP right now in terms of just taking some pressure off and trying to divide potential geopolitical opposition. And yet, maybe you can elaborate on this. Is there a concerted Chinese effort to try to sow chaos and influence this election? similar to kind of the tactics, that Russia rolls out in 2016 to varying degrees. Do we see this accumulating ahead of this election? Because I certainly haven't heard a lot about it on sort of the front page of the news, but it doesn't mean that things aren't going on behind the scenes. So do you detect any Chinese efforts to really influence or just kind of throw wrenches in the spokes of the electoral process for the US coming up?
Yes, but I think it's quite mild, and I think it's not the main thrust of activity. So what Beijing learned was the best way to influence American politics is through influential Americans. It's a much, much easier way of doing it, through the Boeings and the Microsofts and the Starbucks of the world. And Beijing is a lot more concerned with what America thinks about China than it is with what America thinks about America. So there are those actions happening. We can get more into that if you'd like. I think from a US electoral, I do think it's completely 50-50, very original thought there in terms of who's going to win. I do think that both Vance and Waltz are a lot more hawkish than their principals. I do think Trump is surprisingly dovish on the issues that really matter for China, namely US troops in Japan and South Korea, US defense of Taiwan, and US in Asia. I think there's way too much of a focus on economics and not nearly enough of a focus on politics. Beijing cares so much more about the political than it does about the economic. I think there's way too much focus on TSMC and this idea that that's a silicon shield. TSMC is a major semiconductor manufacturer, and there's an idea that China wants to invade Taiwan because of TSMC. And it doesn't hurt. It's part of it, but it's maybe reason 13, out of the top 20. I think in terms of a contested election, my biggest near-term worry is Trump loses, says he wins. There's either chaos or perception of chaos, and Beijing decides that's a good time to seize Kinmen or Matsu, these two small islands off the coast of China that are Taiwanese, or just goes ahead and invades Taiwan. Or Harris wins or Trump wins and it's a clean election, and then Biden has a stroke. Or on December 25th, Beijing thinks that's a great time to invade Taiwan because who's running the country then? Or a week before inauguration. There's all of these weak spots in our political calendar. The Chinese invasion of Taiwan is very weather dependent. So that'll play an outsized role in PLA calculations, and that's hard to predict. The opacity of the top of the Chinese system plays a major role in this because it's just impossible to know how close Xi Jinping is to doing this. We can see troop movements, we can read what comes out of various Chinese ministries. The PLA does not have a spokesperson. The Ministry of Defense, which is under the PLA, has a spokesperson. And so oftentimes that's the body that's speaking. There are PLA newspapers, but the point of these newspapers, they're propaganda outlets, and the point is to communicate what the party wants you to communicate. So it's very difficult to know when it's going to happen, if it's going to happen, but there's enough that's building towards it, which makes me think it's a lot more likely than we think.
Can you elaborate on that? Because that seems like a very important question. We had Dmitry Alperovich sitting in this exact same chair where you sat. He said he thinks 2028 is the year when China is going to outright invade Taiwan. He sketched out a scenario that basically just involves a bolt from the blue attack on US forces in the region, and then just a mad dash using helicopters, ships, car ferries, everything, basically throwing the kitchen sink at Taiwan. And he sketched out a number of reasons why he thinks this is kind of the critical moment there. Just based on what you said right now, I was hoping for reassurance, and you're going to tell us, no, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. But it sounds like you also see the wheels kind of turning. But I wonder what does it look like? What's the likelihood? And when, if something is going to happen, when would you think is the moment of maximum danger?
It's so much more difficult to predict when something happens that something is going to happen. I think all the talk about 2027 or a set time in the future is silly. I think we were talking about this before. There's this Orientalist idea that the Chinese think in centuries. The Chinese think like human beings, and they think about tomorrow, they think about the next week, they think about a couple of years, but they do not think in centuries. And they have 5-year plans, but when you read the 5-year plan a couple of years in, it's almost entirely unrelated to what actually happens. The economy would be much smaller if they really followed that statist Soviet model. I think in terms of war between the US and China, I think Taiwan is the single most likely, but if you add in all the probabilities of other things that could spark conflict or war between the US and China, I think they outweigh Taiwan. So China and India have active border disputes in Arunachal Pradesh. That could spark a war. Would the US go to war with India against China? Probably not, but possibly. Depends how aggressive that war got. China is annexing Bhutan right now. There's parts of Bhutanese territory that the Chinese are illegally building in. Are we going to go to war over Bhutan? Almost certainly not. Will India? Possibly, but probably not. It's happening. They know it. They see it. Could that lead to something? Potentially. It's very unlikely. The Philippines, that's a pretty active conflict zone. Folks who've spent time in China know that, broadly speaking, Chinese don't care terribly about the Taiwanese, but they despise the Japanese in ways that is very visceral and very disheartening. And so I could see it being a lot more popular if Xi Jinping were afraid of losing power to attack Japan than to attack Taiwan, even though Japan is a far more formidable defense establishment. China and Russia, I do not think that's an ironclad relationship. The two sides have fought before. I think they could fight again. Do I think that's likely in the next several years? And I think it's incredibly unlikely. But it's possible. Something could spark from Afghanistan or Pakistan. Something could spark in Ukraine. Something could spark in the Middle East that the Chinese get a lot more involved with. So there's a lot of very unlikely things, incredibly unlikely things that, taken as individual probabilities, almost certainly won't happen. But taken together, sort of like the Marco Polo Bridge incident, that was the sort of cause of the Sino-Japanese War, or even the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip in World War I. It was very easy to say in early 1914 that, hey, I think the risk of a war between European countries is a lot higher than we think. It'd be impossible, almost impossible to say, hey, I think this obscure Serbian group is going to assassinate a minor member of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then that's going to spark the war. That level of precision is basically impossible. And if I say anything that happens, it's luck. But I do feel like we can look at these mass options of things that could happen and realize there's so many potential trigger points. I think too about those spy balloons that were a big story, about a year ago now. And if it's sort of a dark parlor game of the idea that if one of those exploded, how many Americans would have had to kill for us to go to war with China? The answer is probably more than 30. It certainly depends who they are and how gruesome the deaths were. But there's a number, enough Americans die, our baser instincts will take over and we will be at war. One of those balloons explodes and kills 10,000 Americans. I don't care how interconnected our economies are. That is World War III. And so understanding that that is a possibility is, I think, essential for all of us.
So are you saying that the conflict will erupt because there's so many points of contact, and so there's a lot of possibility for some kind of accident that spirals out of control? Or should we be thinking about this? We can talk about archdukes and these kind of precipitating events, but with the benefit of hindsight, you look at something like World War I, and it's like, well, you see these tectonic forces coming together, the rise of Germany and the emergence of the Central Powers, and then the Triple Entente that's basically threatening to crush Germany's hegemonic dreams like a vice, with France and Britain on one side and the Russians coming in from the other side. So if you think it's the latter, like it's these big structural forces that are building up kind of like tension before an earthquake, and while we don't know the exact moment when those tectonic plates will start to shift back and forth, we can talk about the broader tectonic forces. Could you spell those out for us? Conversely, if you think it's just like there's a lot of points of contact, and all you need is some Yahoo, fighter pilot or some balloon or something to go wrong, and it's more just a catalytic accident that sets it off. That would also be interesting to know. But I'm wondering, like, when you look at the broader forces that might be at play here, random or otherwise, what do you think is actually?
I think it is more the broader forces, and I think the idea of knowing what, again, that spark that starts the prairie fire, or the spark that starts the prairie fire, or which assassination, or what kind of death, or what happens to cause that. In 2018, I think in Mumbai, there was a major brownout that people later thought was a Chinese attack. And so under some definitions, that's an act of war. India decided to not see it as one. A lot of the hacking that's happening now, the US could decide to see as an act of war. That's not the narrative, but it's possible to think of it as that. In terms of the tectonic forces, I think the simplest one is China is threatening US hegemony, and it's threatening and is already in the process of upending the global order that the US has led for decades. And the question is, does the US want to allow that? Should the US allow that? We talk about preventing war. The way to prevent a war between the US and China is very simple. The US should give up Taiwan. The US should remove its roughly 30,000 troops from Japan and its 28,500 troops from South Korea, and should say Asia is yours.
You heard it right here. I'm going to hold you to that. It's not running for office anytime soon.
So I think as someone who is certainly on the more hawkish side, especially among people who have lived in China, the question is not how do we do everything we need to prevent a war. I think the issue is if this is going to happen, and it's very humbling, I think should be for all of us to know that we do not have the ability to start or prevent these conflicts. But I feel like what's really missing from the debate is all of the ethical implications, the business implications and the ethical implications. And there's some work on the business implications being done, but I always like to hammer home the points that we need to have a very explicit conversation about how we're going to be in wartime, because otherwise it'll be like we've always been, and baser natures will move forward. The best lack all conviction, worst are filled with passion and intensity. I know that in a war with the US, Beijing is going to treat its people horribly. I think US companies have an obligation to take care of their staffs in China. I worry about what will happen when that happens. I'm very concerned about Chinese Americans here and how they'll be treated in war. And I feel like for folks who are more dovish, any talk of war just shuts them down. They won't have a conversation of, okay, so China attacks Taiwan, slaughters a certain number of Americans, the US goes to war with China. What is the right way to treat our citizens? Because we have a horrible history of discrimination against German Americans during World War I and Japanese Americans during World War II. So how do we not do that again? And talking about that explicitly and trying to put plans or laws or structures in place so that if there is a 9/11 type event, we don't just act in a state of panic. And I think the way humans tend to act to catastrophic events is they tend to panic. And I think we saw that during COVID. We've seen that through wars and famines and problems in the past. And good governance and good laws is, I think, the best solution to that.
What can be done right now to do that? Because my sense is the United States is not psychologically prepared for a major international conflict where it's directly involved. And seems very common in US history, where we just kind of pretend that this thing is not percolating, but then once we get punched in the face, if anything, we overreact and come in, guns hot and full force. So you saw this obviously with Pearl Harbor after 9/11. You could argue the Korean War. We say Korea is not within our defense perimeter, and then when the North takes that as a green light, we say actually we were just kidding. We're going to come intervene, and we didn't really seem to try to deter Saddam Hussein before he was going to invade Kuwait, and then of course we did intervene. So how can we avoid what people call the America trap, where we almost like lure our adversaries into thinking that we're too decadent and divided and distracted to do anything, and so they take that as a green light, and then we freak out and come back in and intervene at much greater cost than if we had just deterred the conflict in the first place, or at least been prepared for it from the start. What can be done besides just smart people like you giving talks like this and saying, hey, we need to take this threat seriously? Are there things that either the US government can do in terms of its messaging from it, speak? What can we do to really get people to pay attention to this issue?
I don't know. It's a great question, and I wish I had a ready-made answer. I wish I could pause and declaim something grand, but I think it has to be a national debate. And I think we have to talk about it. And I think we should decide, and if we can have the foresight of, oh, this is April 2001, and how should we treat Muslims in the States after 9/11? Thinking through that, and I will. I'm not generally a big fan of George Bush, but I will commend him for right after 9/11 being incredibly respectful to Islam and speaking very explicitly about Islam as a relationship of peace and the wonderful Muslim Americans. And so, one of my many worries of Trump is, even if you're just paying lip service to it, regardless of what Bush actually felt about Muslims, these statements are incredibly important, and just making them is important. And so, having that respectful discourse, I think is really important. Beyond that, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
An epic op-ed that'll really turn things around. So my last question before I turn things over to these good people to let them pick your brain. Could you give us a sense of the more global context? So we just saw, North Korea sending 10,000 troops to fight on behalf of Russia in Ukraine. They've been sending them all kinds of artillery shells. You obviously see this bromance between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. There's collusion with Iran, and so some people are talking about this new axis that's opening up. Do you think that's like a thing, that these authoritarian powers are increasingly essentially acting like allies, and that if there is a conflict, we cannot think about, oh, there's a conflict with China and there's a conflict with Russia, and kind of segment these things, and we should abandon Ukraine in order to focus more on Taiwan, or vice versa? Do you think that it's possible to actually deal with these kind of conflicts in a bilateral fashion, or do you think you have to kind of see the whole board, and that events in the Middle East or in Europe may actually have a major effect on the US-China relationship?
The problem with history is that we draw parallels, and it's the way our brains work, and it's a nice way of thinking, but I don't think the axis is the right intellectual framework for what China's doing. Beijing needs to have itself as the center, and I think it's creating a network with Beijing as the metropole, in a way, as the center, bringing China back to the center of the known universe. Beijing, besides what is basically a military alliance with North Korea, Beijing has no allies, and they're pretty explicit about it. It's not the way that they're structured, and so I'm often puzzled by this focus in the US on the China-Russia relationship, because Beijing uses this ridiculously flowery language with so many leaders. And I haven't done the explicit sentiment analysis, but my sense is that he's not more positive to Putin than he is with others as well. There's ways that Beijing would describe its relationship with Pakistan, which, just
higher than the Himalayas, sweeter than honey. What's the standard?
This is a romance novel here. You can read these things and just wonder. But that's part of the way that their diplomacy is conducted. Is they'll say these. It's sort of like the opposite of what North Korea does. We'll say, we're going to rain down fire and fury, and we're going to destroy you. We're going to nuke you this and nuke you that, and then they haven't done it. And that's rhetoric. It's not strategy. But in terms of the global picture, I think what's often missed is how entangled with Beijing and how afraid of Beijing so many other countries are. We think of it as, oh, Beijing is so popular in the global south, or, Beijing's doing so much for Africa. We say Africa as opposed to a series of countries that make up that continent. But there's a lot of fear of economic and political overreach, and of invasion, and of influence across the world from China. Some of it, I think, is reasonable. Some of it, I think, is xenophobic. Some of it is some combination of it. But I do feel like there is a place for the US and China, for the US to pry countries away from China. And we are actively trying to do it. And I think there's much more that can be done with that.
Okay, great. Well, I want to give people a chance to ask questions. So Christine will hand a microphone around. If you could just say who you are and then ask a question.
My name is Jeremy Bach, and you talked a little bit about how the Chinese try to but propagandize, if that's a word, their people to be pro-China. Putin is having a lot of conversation anti-West. Are you sensing that in China, and are the Chinese people themselves anti-American, anti-West, and how does that factor into the greater picture?
It's a great question. And with the broad caveat that there's 1.4 billion people and a lot of different views, I do see more anti-Western sentiment now than I did before. And I don't go back to China anymore. So this is from things I read and people I talk to outside. I do feel like there's a sense that the United States wants to keep China down, which, to be fair, is true. The US does want to keep China down. That is accurate. There's Chinese officials who for so long complained that the US is trying to contain China. And for a long time, the US was not trying to contain China. Now we are trying to contain China. So they're right on that. I feel like there's always been, or for a long time has been, some like pretty strong racist ideas against Japanese, against Black people in China. There's a lot more anecdotal hearings of white people being called foreign trash or being disrespected. There's a lot more violence. A lot of what happens doesn't get reported because there's so many fewer journalists, and Chinese journalists can't report on this. I do think the anti-Western sentiment is significant. I do still feel like there are a lot of Chinese people who have very good things to say about America and want to come here and have a lot of respect for Americans. I do also feel like at least Northern Chinese culture is in many ways pretty akin to the US. Like for folks who have spent time in China, you go from Beijing to New York, you're like, okay, this makes sense. You go from Beijing to Tokyo and you're just like, where am I? Like, why is the world upside down? Those are radically different cultures. But there is a directness in Northern Chinese behavior, which I think many Americans can get. So there are some kinship to those cultures.
There's a lot of focus on the potential for conflict in the South China Sea, with China expanding on those various shoals and so on. So I wonder what your thoughts are, and I have some sense of it, what your thoughts are on the likelihood of a major conflict arising from a minor conflict. And just one more thing, and that is, by my assessment of American reaction to attacks, I think when we're directly attacked, like you mentioned Pearl Harbor, 9/11, but I also think about, during the 60s, the Pueblo taken, we didn't go to war. Now, Nixon railed against Johnson for not responding. And then during Nixon's term, the plane is shot down. We didn't go to war. And I see one instance after all those hostages taking, flash forward, Iran. So do you think it's likely that if there's a clash between two ships, they actually fire at each other, we'd end up going to war? Are the Chinese interested in that war, do you think?
So I've been to the USS Pueblo in Pyongyang. It's now this open air museum where you walk around and you see about the awful spying that the US was doing against the North Koreans and how the brave North Koreans protected themselves against it. I also think of the sinking of the Chonan, which was about a decade ago, where North Koreans sunk a South Korean ship and killed about 4 dozen soldiers, and South Korea decided not to go to war. I do think there are a lot of people, again, this is coming from ignorance because I don't know, and I don't talk to people in the Chinese military establishment. And the ones who do talk to outsiders have a distinct purpose of doing so, which is to prove how dovish they are. But I do think that there are many people in the Chinese military establishment who want to go to war with the US and who want to seize Taiwan and who want to bloody Japan. I try to call it the South Sea instead of the South China Sea because the Chinese call it the South Sea. And they just make us call it the South China Sea in English. I don't know if anyone here speaks Chinese, but the Chinese just call it Nahai, which is just South Sea, and they don't mention the China part. Same thing with the East China Sea, they call it the East Sea. And so it's this kind of funny propagandistic piece of it. It's like with Xi Jinping and chairman. The Chinese are very careful to call him chairman or general secretary and not president, because there's no president in the Chinese system. But then in English, Xinhua and People's Daily will call him President Xi, and they'll do that to try to normalize the Chinese political system. In terms of the likelihood of it sparking a conflict, I think it depends on how tensions are with the US and China at the time that, say, a US ship and a Chinese ship collide. April 2001, there was a US spy plane that hit a Chinese plane. I think something like 25 Chinese soldiers died. And so they held the US pilot in the island of Hainan, and tensions were low enough that they were able to negotiate that out of the conflict. Something like that could have created a conflict or a war, and it didn't. And my fear today is that tensions are so high that you wouldn't be able to have calmer heads prevail, and there'd be too many constituencies in the US and China that wanted to go to war. Or there would be this really strong worry that one side had done it intentionally, as opposed to being able to convince people that it was an accident.
If I look at it from a Chinese perspective, from a Xi's perspective, or the leadership of the CCP, an invasion of Taiwan seems to be a very high risk proposition. And so it raises that assessment may be wrong, but if it's right, then that would suggest that the commitment or the will to go forward, it is that the benefit exceeds, must be more significant than the costs. From the cost standpoint, I don't know that there's any example in history where an invasion over that distance has been successful. There are probably not many data points where it's actually ever been tried. But I don't know how, as a military planner, you could look at that and say there's a high probability of success. So I guess my question is, and I guess the secondary risks are that if you fail, then what are the implications in terms of the continued survival of the regime? Is that something, and I guess it depends on how it's profiled. If it's profiled as a national, it is fundamentally nationalist in nature, we're reintegrating a part of China into China. Well, that sort of is digging in, but if it's something other than that, it's the surrounding countries are not going to look with favor on that. So those are secondary and associated with invasion. So I guess my question is, what are the benefits that exceed those potential costs?
Those are great points. I think a couple thoughts on that. First is we have no idea how, well, so one could say, like, what is rationality, but we also don't know how rational or irrational Xi Jinping is. So he might see these things very different in the way that we describe them. I think in terms of long distance warfare, you probably know more about this than I do, but attacks in World War II, there's plenty of places where the US has projected power in the Pacific, in a distance much further away than China is to Taiwan. It's not that far. I think it's like 150 miles, 200 miles.
100 miles, but if you're talking about an amphibious invasion, you're right. This makes D-Day look like, a piece of cake, because
There's any example of an amphibious invasion?
no, that was under optimal conditions. You're attacking overstretched German troops defending foreign soil with hastily dug positions with mortars and small arms. The Taiwanese have been preparing for this for decades. They got precision guided missiles, and the Taiwan Strait is no joke. It's one of the roughest seas. So, yeah.
So I think in terms of the other big factor in that is, do the US and Japan get involved in that war? It's a very different war if it's China versus Taiwan. And it's also a very different war if it's just China bombing Taiwan into submission, which, you do that and then you can invade. And then also this be the first, I guess, Taiwan is so much more advanced than Ukraine, and you wonder how much a full internet blockade, or how much kind of just turning off all the lights of Taiwan, what kind of cyber attacks could you do that would really shake them? I think in terms of the benefit, one is, of supplanting Mao and being the Chinese leader who did what Mao couldn't, being able to take great national pride in that. I think there's also the great thing about propaganda is, you just spin it how you want to spin it. And so I think, Putin's silly, we got to denazify only country outside of Israel run by a Jewish president, like sure, but that idea has purchase in some parts of Russia. And so there will be real justifications and it's hard to imagine them losing, because if you get to define what victory is. I also think from a military perspective, seizing Kinmen or Matsu is very simple. They're much closer to China than they are to Taiwan. So something like that could happen and then they could stop, or they could assassinate Lai, the Taiwanese president, and then stop. And so there's a possibility there. Looks like we have 5 minutes left?
Hi, I'm Chelsea. My question is in regards to how you're talking about China's influence operations, specifically in Africa, with like the Belt and Road Initiative, and also just like the more like concrete influence operations, and also like the lack of the US operations that are equivalent, or just like also the perception towards the US of Africans based on their intervention in like throughout history. How do you think that will continue to impact the US-China competition? And what can the US do if Africa is already kind of leaning towards China as like a new partner or a new model for development?
I think that's a great question, and my answer is going to be very boring because it's very basic capacity building, strengthening NGOs in Kenya and Zambia, pushing for better labor practices in the Congo. I mean, the Congo is such a mess. It's the source of roughly 2/3 of the world's cobalt, which is key for electric vehicles. And Chinese mining companies dominate in the DRC. And so how do you push for more transparency? How do you raise the cost of Chinese miners there? How do you push for global laws that encourage clean mining? Training African journalists to push back on China. So Xinhua, People's Daily, China Daily, there's money for training programs where they'll bring, say, journalists from Ethiopia to Beijing, and Internews and arms of the US government, you should train journalists from various African nations on how to cover China. And how do you cover Chinese influence locally? Because journalists in Senegal are going to have a much better sense of that than folks like me who fly in and used to do stories on things like that.
Before we let you go, because we kind of jumped right into the fire and brimstone and espionage and all the negative things that can happen and all the threats that China poses, but so that we all kind of leave here on a positive note, is it possible for you to tell us a happy story about how this could end in a good way? Like the US-China relationship could get back on more stable footing, tensions could go down, there could be some change in one government or the other, or some kind of global situation that will lead us to a more optimistic, productive path, and maybe we can even get back to the one world, one dream kind of situation. Some kind of hopeful story that you could foresee, and what, if anything, can the United States do now to make that positive outcome more likely?
And I'm tempted to just say no and like
Well, we have drinks outside.
So 2 thoughts on that. First, so from a business perspective, we work with a lot of US companies and help them manage these risks. And everything with business is risk. There's no risk-free scenario. You make decisions and you can't predict the future, but there are ways of intelligently navigating these issues and doing due diligence on the companies that you may or may not should be working with. From a hopeful perspective, the end of my book, I mentioned a story from when I was reporting in Beijing. This was maybe about a decade or so ago. And I was interviewing this husband and wife who were longtime dissidents. And as we were leaving the building, there was this very decrepit Chinese man in a faded Mao jacket who came up to them, scowled at me, but smiled a bit at them. And I asked who that was. And they said, well, he's the guy who is supposed to spy on us. He's the kind of local community guy, but he's had a really hard life. So, we try to give him tea and be nice to him. And so there's these wonderful ways that humanity shines through. And I hope people like that and not Xi Jinping are the future of China.
That was optimistic. That was good. Please join me in thanking that.